Welcome back. We're going to continue here with Mental Ray for 3ds Max 2010. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the different Mental Ray render setup options that we have available. I'm going to introduce you to them and kind of demystify them for you a little bit and give you a quick overview description of what these different options do. So where do we find the render setup? Well, let's just go here to the rendering main menu, and a shortcut here is F10. You'll see render setup. Let's go ahead and open that up. And at first glance, the render setup, especially to a newcomer to Mental Ray, may seem a bit confusing. There's a lot of different rollouts here with lots of different options. There's also lots of tabs here that we can switch to that, of course, have a lot of rollouts and a lot of options. So let's go ahead and break this down and make it a lot simpler than it looks, because it actually is. The first tab is the Common tab. Now, the Common tab is available not just for Mental Ray, but also for the default scanline renderer. And this tab controls different things here in terms of the image. We can control what gets rendered out. For example, if we want to render out effects or displacement, if we want to render to fields, if we want to go ahead and render out at different sizes, we can change the output size by default, set to 640 by 480 pixels, and we can actually choose different presets here like 800 by 600 or 720 by 486. We can also change the output size here in this drop down box, so we can go with different output settings here. Like say if you want to go with 70mm IMAX, if you want to switch to PAL or NTSC, or you want to do some HD TV video, so on and so forth. You have all of those options here, okay? Now, these options don't pertain specifically to Mental Ray, so we won't be talking about this too much, and really there isn't much else to talk about. The main options here are basically the image output size, as well as the area to render. We want to leave it on the default view because we can switch to those other modes that we saw before, like blow up, crop, region, and selected. But we don't want to do that because for a final render, we want to render out the entire view. We can also choose whether to render out an animation or sequence, or just a single frame here, okay? So that's the Common tab. Again, the Common tab is not the Mental Ray specific tab as the other tabs are. So we're not going to really focus on it too much, and there's not much else to focus on, to be honest with you. Okay. Now the Mental Ray tabs are going to be the Renderer tab here, the Indirect Illumination tab, and the Processing tab. The Render Elements tab is common in 3ds Max. It's not a Mental Ray specific tab. And what the Render Elements tab allows you to do is choose to render out different elements or different render channels. If I click on the Add button here, you notice that I can render out an alpha, I can render out a background or a diffuse channel, I can render out lighting or luminance, HDR data, and a whole bunch of different things here, including a beauty pass, transparency, translucency, specular reflections, so on and so forth. Okay, I can also render out shadows, my Z depth, and a whole bunch of different stuff. I'm just going to hit cancel. But that pertains to the world of compositing and post-production. So we're not going to work with that now, since it really doesn't relate directly to the aspects of Mental Ray that we want to cover in this training product. So let's look at the actual Mental Ray settings here that we're going to be working with, and the ones that are important for everyday work here when you're doing client work and working on projects and things like that. Now the Renderer tab here has a whole bunch of different rollouts here. I like to close all of my rollouts and only expand and use the rollouts as I need them. Because when you have all these rollouts opened up, it can actually look a lot more complicated than it actually is. And it's just easier in my eyes when they're all closed. So I can right click here, go to close all, and it closes all of the rollouts here at the same time. Okay, so the Renderer tab has 5 different rollouts. The first rollout is the Global Tuning Parameters rollout. This is a new parameter rollout in Max 2010. And what's so great about this new rollout or these new options is that we have global controls over different quality settings. We can control globally the quality of our soft shadows, which are area shadows. We can also control our glossy reflection sampling and our glossy refractions sampling here using these global multipliers, which you couldn't do before with Mental Ray 3ds Max. So this is actually a great feature in version 2010. Okay, it's the same thing if I go ahead and do a render frame here, hitting Shift and Q. If you remember before, we talked about these settings down here, like the image precision, the soft shadows, glossy reflections down here, and the glossy refractions precision down here. These are the same settings that you see here in the render setup window as the soft shadows precision, glossy reflections precision, and glossy refractions precision. Okay? It's just that you can find it in two different locations. We can control that from the render frame window, or we can control it from the render setup window over here. Alright? Below this rollout, we have a sampling quality rollout, and this is one that you're going to be using very often when working with Mental Ray in 3ds Max. Now again, the sampling quality or anti-aliasing quality settings are located here. You can also find them in the render frame window right here in this section called Image Precision Anti-Aliasing. Okay? Now the general rule is pretty simple. The lower your anti-aliasing, the faster you'll render out. The more anti-aliasing you have, the longer the render is going to take, but the higher quality it's going to have. Now this is where you control the sampling. You have a minimum and maximum sampling. Okay? You can see here in the drop down box, you have different numbers that you can choose here. Okay? And for the maximum, we have different numbers we can choose here. Okay? Now if we go back here, you'll notice that we have this image precision button, and it's set to medium right now, which is a minimum of 1/4 or 1/4 and a maximum of 4. These are the samplings per pixels of the ray tracing involved here with the renderer. And we'll talk about that more later. So don't worry about it too much now if it doesn't make any sense. But the general rule is if we lower the anti-aliasing to say 1/16 and a max of 1, you're going to be at a low setting, which we can see here, and the render is going to go by faster, but it's going to have lower quality. So if I go down here to say the draft preset and I hit render, you'll notice that the render has a lot of jagged edges, as you can see here. We have all these sort of blocky jagged edges, which looks very reminiscent of old Atari video games if you ever played those. Okay? Now you notice that the render also went pretty fast. If we go ahead and take this slider and take it all the way to the very high setting here, which is a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 64, which is a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 64 samples per pixel, you'll notice that if I hit render, the render takes a little bit longer, as you can see. But we get a very nice, smooth, crisp render. We don't get those jagged edges. We get a very nice final result. So you're trading speed for quality by controlling this setting. By default, it's set to medium right here. So we can control those settings from here in the render setup window, or you can control it here from the render frame window. Okay? We also have a filter type, and you notice that some of these options here are not available in the render frame window. We can't control the filter type from here, so we have to go to the render setup window. Now the filter type is going to apply a filter over our sampling quality here. So by default, set the box filter. That's actually pretty good for doing preview type renders when you're doing fast renders. But I like to use a Mitchell filter when I'm doing a final production render. And you'll notice that as I switch to different filters, the width and the height parameters here change. So the box filter is a 1 pixel filter. The Gaussian is a 3. Triangles a 2. Mitchell Lancos are each 4, as you can see. So the Gaussian filter is going to apply a little bit of a blur. The triangle is going to be a little bit sharper than the Gaussian, but it's still going to be a little bit better than the box. Now the Mitchell Lancos are going to be probably the nicest filters. They're nice and smooth and pretty crisp. I like to use again the Mitchell filter when doing a final production render. Okay, so I'll keep it at box for now. Now the spatial contrast is very important. We have a red, green, blue, and alpha spatial contrast controls. These are very important when you're talking about anti-aliasing. The lower the setting, the longer the render is going to take, but the nicer it's going to look. Simply because the lower the setting, the lower the contrast, okay, the more you're telling Mental Ray to apply anti-aliasing on your image, especially if you have a very high contrast image, which we actually don't right here. This is not a very high contrast image. It's got a fair amount of contrast, but not a super high amount of contrast. The more contrast your image has, the longer it's going to take to render when you're using low settings here, which by default is set to about 0.05 for the red, green, blue, and the alpha channels, which you can see here. Okay, you can also go here and click on this color box to open up a color selector window, and you can actually choose your contrast here by actually choosing different colors here. Okay, you usually want to keep it to grayscale, black and white, and not these colors. but you could if you wanted to. I'll hit cancel. Down here we have a few other options here. We're not going to concern ourselves with those at the moment, simply because there's so many options that we could actually sit here for an extremely long period of time going over every single option. And a lot of these options are not important and are not going to make a difference in your day-to-day workflow. Okay? So right here we have a bucket order. We can actually choose the bucket order of how we render out. So for example, if I choose spiral, if I go ahead and hit render, you notice that the bucket order starts here at the center and starts to go outward and outward and outward. Now, if you didn't notice it, it's because it happened so fast. Is there a huge difference between Spiral and Hilbert, which is the default? Not really. I like to keep it at the default Hilbert since it works out pretty good. You can also choose from bottom up, for example, if you want the render tiles to start from the bottom and work their way up. If I hit clear, it's a little bit more obvious. I'll hit render, and you see it starts at the bottom and works its way up. It's a little bit difficult to see because it renders out so fast, but I'll leave it at Hilbert. Again, a lot of these options are very simple options that make very little difference to you when you're rendering out. So there's really no point in wasting too much time dissecting them. Right here we have a frame buffer type. This one's actually pretty important. We can render out our image to 16 bits per channel, or floating point 32 bits per channel, depending on what the project requirements are. And usually you'll have a boss or somebody that's going to go ahead and give you those specific parameters and requirements for the rendering job. Okay, so down here we have a rendering algorithms rollout, and we have some more options here. As you can see, we have tons and tons of options. We can turn on scanline mode or turn it off. Usually it's good to leave it on, which is the default setting, which allows Mental to render out faster. Ray tracing, we can turn that off or turn that on. Usually we want to have that on because usually you want to have ray tracing on when you're working on photorealistic rendering, or most rendering jobs are going to require ray tracing at some point in time. Okay. Now right here we can use ray tracing acceleration. We can switch between the old BSP, which is just this default BSP, or binary space partitioning, or we can switch to BSP2, which is a newer algorithm that renders out a little bit faster and more stable when working with huge scenes with tons and tons of polygons. We're going to keep it at the default. Okay, we have a size and depth parameter which we can use to tune the BSP, which can actually boost render performance by considerable amounts. The default settings are actually pretty good. And down here we have reflection and refraction settings, where we can choose how many rays we want to allow to reflect and refract in our scene. So if we're using materials like glass, anything that's transparent, or mirrored type reflections on objects like say chrome or a mirror, we can actually control that here. Okay. Now down here we have a camera effects rollout, and we can turn on things like motion blur. We can turn on contours. We can actually apply lens output and volume shaders. We can actually apply depth of field, mental ray depth of field. Let's collapse that. And then finally we have a shadows and displacement rollout, where we can change shadow parameters and displacing. We can activate displacement here. We can also go ahead and activate shadows. And we can enable different types of shadows, for example, simple, sort, and segments mode. We'll talk about that later. We can also disable shadows altogether, in case you don't want to render out shadows for whatever reason. Mental Ray is very flexible and gives you the option to change pretty much anything you want about your render. Then over here we have an Indirect Illumination tab, and we only have 3 rollouts. A Final Gather rollout, which has a ton of options, and we're going to be going over that later in depth. And then we have a Caustics and Global Illumination, also known as GI for short. And this parameter set here, this rollout, has a whole bunch of different parameters that control photons and global illumination inside of Mental Ray. And we're going to be looking at that very in-depth later. And then we have this new reuse rollout here that's new in Max 2010. And the parameters and controls here are not that new, except for a couple. But mainly what they did in Max 2010 was they moved these parameters that were located here and were located here, and they moved it into its own rollout just so it's a little bit easier and a little bit more straightforward to work with these parameters. It just made a lot of sense to place these parameters in the reuse parameter rollout here, instead of having these different parameters kind of strewn about in different rollouts here, like for the Final Gather and Global Illumination. So it makes a little bit more sense for them to be here. Okay. Then we have a processing here, tab. Processing has only 3 parameter rollouts. We have translator options here, which you can see here we have different things here like geometry caching, which we can actually activate here from the render frame window. If you see that we have this reuse area here, parameters, here's geometry caching right here. And we'll talk about that later. Okay. We can also go ahead and go to our diagnostics here, and we can actually turn on diagnostics. Diagnostics allow you to go ahead and diagnose different things in your scene, like the BSP. We can also diagnose the global illumination photons and a final gathering in our scene, just in case if we see that we're having some kind of problem, or we just want to diagnose something to get a better idea of what's going on under the hood. That's more for advanced users of mental ray. And then out here, we have distributed bucket rendering. We don't want to go ahead and concern ourselves with this because this relates to working with several computers to help you render out on your main workstation. So if I have several, say 4 or 5 other computers hooked up to this one, I can actually turn on distributed render, and I can change a few options here pertaining to distributed rendering, which we're not going to deal with here because it's a little bit outside the scope of what we're going to be talking with here with mental ray. Okay, so that's going to cover this brief, very quick overview here of these different options. And I just did this video to go ahead and basically take out a little bit or a lot of the fear that goes into mental ray, simply because newcomers will look at this render setup window and they'll just think to themselves, oh my goodness, look at all these parameters. I have to learn how to use all this stuff. So by fearlessly coming in here and going over this stuff very quickly and very easily, just makes it a little bit more comfortable to work with mental ray once you've been over some of those settings and once you've gotten an overview of what some of those things do. Okay, but this video's gone long enough, and I'm going to end it here, and in the next one we'll continue here with mental ray.